On May 27, 1917, the German submarine SMU-66 was sunk off the coast of the islands of Scilly with all hands lost. It was a significant victory in the war against the German U-boats. The SMU-66 had been responsible for sinking more than 30 vessels with torpedoes and mines. And what's more important, SMU-66 commander Oberlieutenant zur See Herbert Pushtuken was one of Imperial Germany's most successful submarine commanders, responsible for sinking more than 80 vessels, including the cruiser HMS Penelope. But was perhaps more interesting was not just that the SMU-66 was sunk, but how it was sunk, by a Curtiss flying boat of the Royal Naval Air Service. That was a rare victory for airplanes in a war where the technology of military airplanes and military submarines was still new. That contest would become more complex and more deadly in the next war. The contest between the airplanes of RAF Coastal Command and the U-boats of the Kriegsmarine in the Second World War was deadly for both. It is history that deserves to be remembered. While not their first use in war, the Great War represented the first time that submarines would become a major factor in war. From the outset, combating submarines became a matter of competing technologies. In 1915, the British Admiralty created the Board of Invention and Research, or the BIR, under former First Sea Lord Admiral Jackie Fisher, with the purpose of providing expert assistance in organizing and encouraging scientific effort in relation to the requirements of the naval services. A significant amount of the work of the BIR focused on countering the U-boat menace. The work of the BIR mostly came too late to impact the war, however, and focused mostly on acoustic technology, which would develop between the wars. Another technology that developed during the war was air power, but the two technologies that grew to importance in the First World War had little impact on each other. Of 178 German U-boats sunk to combat in the Great War, most were lost to mines, and only a small handful, arguably less than 5, were lost to aircraft. Aircraft of the Great War lacked range, giving them limited ability to search for U-boats. An article published by the Imperial War Museum quoted RAF pilot Gordon Hyams, who escorted troop convoys in the Mediterranean searching for U-boats. "We could do up to 4 hours and then leave them and come back, but at any rate we never saw anything." Airships could patrol much longer, but had little more luck. The same Imperial War Museum article quoted Leslie Merton, a coxswain of airship SST-3 that patrolled the channel for U-boats. "We used to spot for submarines, and if you thought you saw one, you'd drop a mine on them, and if you got oil, you knew you'd struck one. But we never struck any oil. We never struck any, though we were flying all the time." Part of the reason is simple. A U-boat on the surface could see an aircraft before an aircraft could see them. By the time the aircraft passed, the U-boat had submerged. U-boats were most vulnerable at night when they surfaced to recharge their batteries, but aircraft in the Great War were not equipped for night flying and had no ability to detect the U-boats. Even where they saw a U-boat, the weapons planes used to attack them were unreliable. When the German U-boat U-156 attacked a group of barges off of Cape Cod, Massachusetts in June of 1918, the only German attack on the U.S. mainland in the Great War, U.S. Navy planes responded, catching the U-boat on the surface, its crew distracted by their firing at the barges. But the Mark IV bombs from the 2 U.S. Navy float planes designed to attack submarines failed to explode. One pilot was so frustrated he threw a wrench at the submarine. Aircraft did play a role in the fight against U-boats in the Great War. They forced them to submerge. They reduced their targets. They pointed out their location to surface vessels. But submarines still had very little to fear directly from aircraft. In their eventually very extensive efforts to determine strategies to fight the U-boats in the Great Wars, the Admiralty barely even mentioned airplanes. But that story would be different in the war to come. Between the wars, the general demobilization meant that few resources were applied to new anti-submarine warfare technologies, but the capability of planes as a response to submarines increased. Aircraft development produced planes with greater range and reliability, and the development of a radar altimeter, more accurate than the previous altimeters which relied on barometric pressure, allowed safe flight levels as low as 50 feet, greatly increasing accuracy when attacking a submarine. The development of an airborne radar called ASV, or Airborne Surface Vessel, allowed planes to detect U-boats on the surface. While it offered some advantage during the day, U-boats usually surfaced at night to recharge batteries, the point where they were most vulnerable. While the radar operated at night, it was only able to direct the plane within about a mile of the boat. It was not accurate enough to successfully facilitate an attack on a boat that the plane could not see. And the Germans quickly developed a countermeasure, a detector called METOX. The U-boats carried a receiver tuned to pick up the radar at a safe distance, in essence telling the U-boat that the plane was searching for it. This allowed the submarine to submerge before the airplane arrived. According to the website uboat.net, in the years 1939 to 1941, only 2 U-boats were sunk by aircraft of Coastal Command. This is partly due to a limited number of long-range planes, as Bomber Command was given priority over Coastal Command. Anti-submarine patrols were often done with obsolete aircraft, some too small to even carry the best depth charges. The lack of long-range aircraft meant that the Atlantic convoys had a large section of the North Atlantic called the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or more ominously, the Black Pit, that was out of range of planes of Coastal Command. Not only did planes still lack capability against the U-boats, but the U-boats had significant hunting territory that the planes could not even normally reach. The tide slowly changed, however. Twin-engine medium bombers proved more vulnerable over Europe, and Bomber Command preferred 4-engine bombers like the Avro Lancaster. This meant that Coastal Command started getting more capable and longer-range twin-engine bombers like the Vickers Wellington and the Lockheed Hudson. Later, Coastal Command would be able to acquire larger bombers with longer ranges, such as the consolidated B-24. 2 key technologies made a significant difference. First, the Lee light, first tested in 1941, was a powerful 24-inch, 22 million candlelight searchlight. The light allowed bombers to illuminate and accurately attack U-boats at night. But Lee lights weren't being regularly installed until mid-1942, and by then many of the German U-boats were carrying METOCs, which largely nullified the advantage of airborne radar. Still, the tide was beginning to turn. Having collected just 2 kills against U-boats between 1939 and 1941, in 1942 the planes of Coastal Command collected 31 U-boat kills. But 1943 represented the real turning point. Allied scientists developed a shorter wavelength radar called ASV-3 that could not be detected. As Coastal Command obtained more long-range aircraft capable of carrying generators to power the Lee light and equipped with ASV-3, the U-boats were suddenly vulnerable at night. U-boat commanders found that they could be attacked completely by surprise. As a response, in May 1941, U-boats were issued Standing War Order 483. Because of vulnerability at night, U-boats would now maximize their time submerged at night and surface during the day. While that made them more visible, it meant that they could at least see the bombers before they attacked. U-boats were equipped with more anti-aircraft defenses, including dismountable twin 20mm cannons. No longer to so easily submerge before an aircraft arrived, now the U-boats would try to shoot the planes down. The order was popularly known as the Fight Back Order. This set up a significant confrontation, especially in the Bay of Biscay, the Atlantic Gulf along the coast of France, where Allied planes targeted German U-boats going to and from their bases in southern France. It was a deadly fight for both sides, but the order was welcomed by Air Marshal Sir John Slessor, commander of RAF Coastal Command. U-boats standing and fighting certainly put his crews at greater risk, but it also meant that they could sink more U-boats. Slessor knew that he had more planes than the Germans had U-boats. It was a war of attrition that he knew he could win. The summer of 1943 was deadly, both for the crews of the U-boats and the crews of the aircraft of Coastal Command that hunted them. Sometimes both would destroy each other, with not a single survivor left to tell the story. One example where that nearly happened illustrated the brutality of these deadly duels over the lonely Atlantic. Lloyd Trigg was born in New Zealand in 1914. He went to university, became a farmer, and served in a local regiment of the New Zealand Territorial Force. New Zealand followed the United Kingdom into war with the Axis in 1939, and in June 1941, Trigg, then married with 2 children, enlisted in the Royal New Zealand Air Force as a trainee pilot. He earned his wings the following January and was commissioned a pilot officer. By January 1943, he was a flight officer with RAF Coastal Command, flying with No. 200 Squadron, based in the West African nation of Gambia. The squadron flew both convoy escort patrols and anti-submarine patrols. Trigg became an experienced pilot and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in June 1943. No. 200 Squadron operated the Lockheed Hudson, but in May 1943, Trigg was sent to the Bahamas to train on the consolidated B-24. After training, he flew to Canada to pick up the plane earmarked for his squadron and then returned to his base in Gambia. On August 11th, he left on his first operational mission in the Liberator. German submarine U-468 was a Type 7C U-boat. The Type 7 U-boat was the workhorse of the German U-boat fleet and the most produced submarine design in history. U-468 was commissioned in August 1942 under the command of Oberlieutenant Clemens Schmang. The U-boat sank a British tanker in the North Atlantic during its first war patrol in January 1943. On May 22nd, while on its second war patrol in the mid-Atlantic, the boat came under air attack, attacked by 2 U.S. Navy Grumman Avengers and then a Grumman Wildcat of the Royal Air Force. The submarine, following the fight back order issued on May 1st, managed to damage and fend off all 3 aircraft, although U-468 was damaged itself and forced to return to base. U-468 left on its 3rd patrol from the south of France in July and sailed south along the coast of Africa. On August 11th, it was on the surface when it encountered Flight Officer Trigg and the crew of his B-24. Type 7 submarines by that time were equipped with a significant anti-aircraft armament. The U-468 mounted 1 37mm and 4 20mm anti-aircraft guns in 2 double mounts. Because of the anti-aircraft armament, bombers of RAF Coastal Command did not always immediately attack submarines that they saw on the surface. They would rather vector a surface vessel there if one was available. But Flight Officer Trigg did not have that option. The crew of U-468 opened up with their 20mm gun mounts and struck home immediately, damaging the B-24 and setting it afire before Trigg and his crew could even set up an attack run. Chamong and his crew might have hoped their fire would drive off the B-24, as they had managed to drive off the air attacks on the submarine in May, but Trigg would not be deterred. He could have chosen to ditch the plane in the ocean, but despite the heavy damage to his plane, he set up an attack run, even though it meant exposing his plane to more deadly fire. Flying directly at the submarine, Trigg and his plane would be an easier target, as the gunners did not have to worry about deflection as leading their target. The attack run also increased the time the plane would be in the air, and as a report on the incident later explained, every second spent in the air would increase the extent and intensity of the flames and diminish his chances of survival. The report said of Trigg, there could have been no hesitation or doubt in his mind. Chamong said that Trigg ran into the attack with great determination and without deviating to avoid the U-boat's sustained and heavy fire. The plane, in flames and ripped by the anti-aircraft guns, screamed over the U-boat at less than 50 feet. It was clear that the plane was doomed. But as it came over, Chamong said, we saw his ash cans coming down on us, and they exploded and damaged the boat to death. The B-24 crashed into the ocean some 1,000 feet away. There were no survivals among his crew. Chamong said such a gallant fighter as Trigg would have been decorated in Germany with the highest medal of order. As the depth charges exploded, U-468 was thrown violently upward and suffered catastrophic damage and sank quickly. In fact, the fight may have been one of those incidents where there were no survivors to tell the story, except that the B-24 crew had apparently prepared a life raft and had been dropped or fallen from the plane. Eventually, 7 members of the crew, including Oberlieutenant Chamong, managed to climb into the raft. A day later, the raft was found by a short S-25 Sunderland flying boat that had been sent out to find the missing B-24's crew. The pilot later said that they could very plainly from the air see sharks circling the dinghy. But the Sunderland crew could easily recognize the raft as being from an Allied bomber and assumed that it was the downed air crew. They dropped a supply package and a dye marker. The Flower-class Royal Navy corvette HMS Clarica arrived the next day, surprised to find that the men in the raft were not the RAF air crew, but Germans from the U-boat. The only narrative we have of Flight Officer Trigg's heroic effort to bring his attack home was because Oberlieutenant Chamong survived in the raft from Trigg's plane. On November 2nd, 1943, Flight Officer Lloyd Trigg was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest award for valor in the face of the enemy, solely on the testimony of Oberlieutenant Zersi Clemens Chamong. While other Victoria Cross recommendations included testimony from enemy combatants, Flight Officer Trigg's Victoria Cross is unique, the only one in history awarded solely on the testimony of an enemy combatant without any corroboration from Allied personnel. The citation for Trigg's award read, "The Battle of the Atlantic has yielded many fine stories of air attacks on underwater craft, but Flying Officer Trigg's exploit stands out as an epic of grim determination and high courage. His was the path of duty that leads to glory." The so-called fight back order remained in effect for 97 days in the summer of 1943, and in that period 26 U-boats were sunk and 17 damaged by planes of RAF Coastal Command in the Bay of Biscay. In exchange, RAF Coastal Command lost 28 aircraft. In 1943, 244 U-boats were lost in combat. Changing tactics, the advent of escort carriers, which closed the mid-Atlantic gap, and new anti-submarine warfare technologies had turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.